Hey guys, tonight we're rediving into one of history's strangest financial stories. The time an entire nation lost its mind over a flower. It's the 17th century, and the Netherlands has just become the richest country on earth. Amsterdam's canals glitter with the reflections of merchant houses built on trade with the East. Ships return from Asia loaded with porcelain, silk, and spices. Bankers count silver coins by the bucket. The printing presses hum with stock certificates and letters of credit. Money feels infinite, and ambition even more so. And then comes a tulip. Delicate, fragile, useless, yet destined to become the most valuable object in Europe. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop a comment below with your location and local time. I love knowing where in the world these stories are reaching tonight. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together, to the Dutch Golden Age. When wealth bloomed, reality wilted and a flower taught humanity its first great lesson about money. In the early 1600s, the Dutch Republic stood at the center of the world. Its fleet of merchant ships, more than all other European nations combined, carried cargo from the Caribbean to Japan, spices from the Moluccas, textiles from India, silver from the Americas. Everything passed through the quays of Amsterdam. This flood of wealth transformed a once provincial people into masters of commerce. At the heart of this prosperity was the Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602, the first joint stock company in history, and the first to issue tradable shares. Investors could buy a portion of the company's profits, and the Amsterdam Exchange, the world's first true stock market, was born. For the first time, ordinary citizens could gamble not with dice, but with global trade itself. The Dutch built their republic on water and credit. Their land was reclaimed from the sea. Their economy was built on confidence. As long as everyone believed in the system, the dikes held, and the coins kept flowing. Banks perfected bookkeeping. Insurance became an art form. Even small merchants speculated in futures contracts, buying the promise of goods months before ships returned from Asia. Yet, beneath all this rational precision, something irrational stirred. The same discipline that kept the seas out of their fields could not keep emotion out of their finances. Prosperity bred restlessness. Success demanded novelty. Having conquered the world's oceans, the Dutch now sought to conquer taste itself through art, luxury, and beauty. Painters like Rembrandt and Vermeer captured the stillness of wealth. Domestic calm, polished silver, quiet pride. But outside those painted interiors, a fever was building, a hunger for something new to symbolize status. And that symbol arrived from far away, wrapped in velvet and mystery. A single bulb from the east, small enough to fit in one hand, yet destined to become the center of an empire of speculation. It began innocently enough. Tulips, imported from the Ottoman Empire, thrived in the Dutch climate. They bloomed brighter and more vividly than in their native soil. Their colors so intense, they seemed painted. The flower quickly became a collector's delight, rare, exotic, and infinitely variable. In a country that measured success in trade and precision, the tulip embodied perfection. It was a living commodity, delicate yet valuable, that mirrored the Dutch themselves. Resilient, refined, and cultivated. Soon, every wealthy household in Amsterdam wanted tulips in its garden. But beauty alone was not enough to explain what came next. The tulip would soon leave the soil and enter the marketplace, becoming not just a flower, but a currency, a promise, and, ultimately, a lesson written in petals and paper. The tulip's journey to the Netherlands began far from the misty canals of Amsterdam. It started in the rocky valleys and windswept plateaus of Central Asia, where wild tulips had bloomed for millennia. From there, the flower traveled west along the trade routes of Persia and Anatolia until it reached the heart of another empire, Ottoman, Istanbul. In the 16th century, the tulip was already more than a plant to the Ottomans. It was a cultural obsession. Ottoman gardeners bred tulips with obsessive care, producing hundreds of varieties, each with subtle differences in color, shape, and fragrance. To the Ottoman elite, the tulip represented perfection, a symbol of paradise, eternal beauty, and divine order. Its name, Lale, written in Arabic script, shared the same letters as Allah, and so the flower became both a spiritual emblem and an aesthetic one. At the height of Ottoman splendor under Suleiman, the magnificent tulips adorned fabrics, tiles, and poetry. Court artists painted their delicate outlines. Palace architects carved them into marble fountains. Entire festivals celebrated the flower's bloom. It was during this age of Ottoman elegance that the tulip began its westward journey, carried not by merchants seeking profit, but by diplomats and scholars enchanted by its grace. Among them was Ogier Ghiselin de Busbecq, a Flemish ambassador sent by the Holy Roman Emperor to Suleiman's court in the 1550s. While in Istanbul, Uzbek admired the strange, flame-shaped flowers that decorated the imperial gardens. He sent bulbs home to Europe, introducing the tulip to the gardens of Vienna, Augsburg, and eventually the Low Countries. In the Netherlands, the flower found its ideal environment. The Dutch climate, cool, wet, and temperate, suited the tulip perfectly. The soil near Haarlem and Leiden, sandy yet fertile, produced bulbs of extraordinary color. Dutch gardeners, already among Europe's most skilled horticulturalists, began experimenting with breeding, creating countless new varieties. At first, tulips were a botanical curiosity, admired by scholars, apothecaries, and collectors. The Leiden Botanical Gardens, founded in 1590, cultivated some of the first Dutch tulips under the supervision of Carolus Clusius, a pioneering botanist who received bulbs directly from Busbecq's collection. Clusius recognized their value, both scientific and aesthetic, but he could not have imagined the fever they would soon inspire. Tulips were different from any other plant in Europe. Their blooms were brief yet brilliant, lasting only a few days, and their forms seemed to defy repetition. Even more mysterious was the phenomenon of breaking, where the petals of a solid-colored tulip developed streaks or flames of contrasting color. These broken tulips, with patterns of red, white, yellow, or purple, were caused by a virus that altered pigment distribution in the petals. Gardeners didn't understand the cause, but they believed these mutations were signs of divine favor. As the 17th century began, tulips moved from academic gardens into the private estates of the rich. The wealthy merchants of Amsterdam and Haarlem competed to collect the rarest varieties, treating them as living jewels. Owning a tulip garden became a mark of sophistication, a statement that one's wealth had ascended beyond mere trade into taste. In portraits from this era, Dutch nobles posed with tulips beside them, a deliberate symbol of refinement, similar to how modern financiers might flaunt rare watches or art collections. The flowers were given names that reflected power and prestige: Admiral Banderijk, Generalissimo Viceroy, and, of course, the legendary Semper Augustus. The Semper Augustus became the most coveted tulip in history. With its pure white petals streaked in blood-red flames, it was considered the pinnacle of beauty and the rarest of all. Each bulb was said to produce only a few flowers, and each flower was unique. By the 1630s, a single bulb could cost more than a canal-side mansion in Amsterdam. What made tulips so alluring to the Dutch was not only their beauty but also what they represented. The flower, imported from the opulent East, embodied a mix of mystery, luxury, and exoticism. In a society that valued precision and restraint, tulips offered controlled indulgence, an object of beauty that could be cultivated, measured, and, crucially, traded. Tulips became conversation pieces at dinner tables, subjects of poems, and central motifs in still-life paintings. Artists like Ambrosius Boschiet and Jan Davis de Heem painted tulip arrangements that captured not only the flowers, delicate forms, but also their moral weight, beauty that fades, vanity that costs, and wealth that never lasts. By the 1620s, the tulip had moved beyond art and into economics. Wealthy collectors began buying and selling bulbs as investments. At first, these were real exchanges. Physical bulbs dug up and passed from one garden to another. But soon, merchants realized something extraordinary. The flower didn't even have to bloom to be valuable. It could be sold on the promise of its future beauty. Contracts were signed for bulbs still underground, unseen, and unbloomed. These agreements, a precursor to modern futures trading, allowed people to speculate on what a tulip might be worth months later. The trade was small at first, limited to aristocrats and botanists. But like all beautiful things in the hands of ambitious people, it began to spiral into something much larger. No one yet imagined that the delicate flower from the Ottoman gardens would one day bring ruin to thousands of Dutch citizens. The seeds of mania had been planted quietly, invisibly in the soil of prosperity itself. By the 1620s, the tulip had become the ultimate object of prestige in the Dutch Republic, a society obsessed with order, elegance, and appearances. The same merchants who built fortunes trading spices and sugar now competed over gardens, treating tulip bulbs as symbols of refinement and moral virtue. To own rare tulips was to announce that one had mastered both nature and fortune. Dutch cities like Haarlem, Leiden, and Amsterdam were filled with gardens that resembled miniature works of art, geometric, precise, and filled with imported plants. Tulips were there, crown jewels. A garden bursting with vibrant varieties, carefully labeled and documented, became the new status symbol of the merchant elite. Collectors compared tulips as others might compare diamonds or paintings, debating hue, shape, and rarity. This fascination was not limited to the wealthy. The Dutch Golden Age was unique in that its prosperity extended to a broad middle-class artisans, craftsmen, ship captains, and traders who could afford luxuries once reserved for nobility. In their neatly kept homes, with polished tiles and brass ornaments, tulips became a small but potent display of success. The fascination turned into a kind of horticultural competition. Manuals were published detailing how to grow, crossbreed, and care for bulbs. Artists painted catalogs of tulip varieties with almost scientific precision. The most famous was the Florilegium, an illustrated register of flowers that treated tulips as botanical royalty. Each new variety received a name evoking dignity or conquest. Admiral Bunder Eik, Generalissimo, Viceroy, or Alexander. These names spoke to the Dutch self-image. Disciplined, global, and triumphant. But not all tulips were equal. The most prized varieties were the broken ones, those whose petals bore flame-like streaks of color. What collectors didn't know was that these striking patterns were the result of a virus carried by aphids. Far from making the plants healthier, the infection weakened them, reducing their ability to reproduce. Ironically, this fragility made them even more desirable. Rarity, after all, was the lifeblood of luxury. As the market for tulips grew, so did the language around them. Tulip dealers began using terms like common goods and rarities, classifying bulbs with the precision of merchants handling spices. A sort of informal pricing system developed. A plain red or yellow tulip might cost a few guilders, while a rare broken variety could fetch hundreds, even thousands. Collectors built reputations around their gardens. Invitations to view new blooms became social events. The most successful growers guarded their bulbs like secrets, refusing to sell or share them. A gardener with a thriving patch of variegated tulips might receive visitors from across the country, eager to glimpse the latest creation of nature's artistry. Still, the flower's appeal went deeper than status. For a nation that had clawed its land from the sea, the tulip represented control proof. But nature, itself, could be disciplined, shaped, and cultivated. The Dutch had built dikes to hold back the ocean. Now they built gardens to hold beauty in its place. The tulip also mirrored the values of the Republic itself: precision, restraint, and quiet grandeur. Unlike the rose, with its sensual abundance, or the lily, with its religious overtones, the tulip was clean and symmetrical, a symbol of order. It bloomed briefly, perfectly, and then vanished, a natural metaphor for the fleeting nature of fortune. And fortune was what the Dutch increasingly sought. The same merchants who collected tulips also invested in ships, spices, and stocks. They understood risk, speculation, and profit. In that world, the tulip was not just a flower. It was a financial instrument waiting to happen. By the 1630s, an entire social economy had formed around tulips. Skilled gardeners bred new varieties. Painters immortalized them on canvas. Merchants sold bulbs through intermediaries. Prices rose steadily, and demand seemed endless. Wealthy buyers boasted of paying small fortunes for bulbs that had yet to bloom. Tulips had become commodities. The love of beauty had transformed into a marketplace of desire. What began as elegance was turning into obsession. A telling moment came in 1634, when a tulip known as the Viceroy sold for an astonishing 2,500 guilders, enough to buy a fine townhouse on one of Amsterdam's canals. Soon after, rumors spread that even the humble artisans of Haarlem were buying and selling bulbs, hoping to profit. The flower that had once adorned the gardens of scholars was now entering taverns, counting houses, and street corners. Painters began capturing this strange new world. Still life paintings of the period show lush bouquets beside coins, skulls, and hourglasses. Visual warnings that beauty and wealth are fleeting. The tulip, once a symbol of divine perfection, had become a symbol of vanity. The transition from passion to profit was almost invisible at first. Collectors still spoke of art and nature, of admiration and taste. But their ledgers told another story. As one Dutch chronicler wrote later, every tulip was no longer a flower. It was a promissory note. The Dutch Republic, with its banks, contracts, and merchants, had unknowingly created something entirely new. A speculative market. The tulip had ceased to belong to gardens. It now belonged to money. The air in Haarlem's taverns grew thick with talk of bulbs, contracts, and prices. But for the moment, no one thought it dangerous. The economy was booming. The ships kept sailing, and the flowers kept blooming. The Dutch had built a world where faith and wealth felt as solid as the dikes that held back the sea. They did not yet realize how fragile both could be. By the mid-1630s, the tulip had fully escaped the garden. It no longer existed only as a flower that could be admired or cultivated. It had become something abstract, a certificate of value, a promise of profit, and, above all, a speculative asset. In coffeehouses, taverns, and merchant offices across the Netherlands, people began trading not tulips themselves, but contracts representing future ownership of bulbs that were still lying dormant in the soil. This new system was called wind handle, literally the wind trade. It was a fitting name, for the market dealt in nothing tangible, merely the air of expectation. A buyer would agree to purchase a specific bulb after the next harvest, and the seller would promise to deliver it at that time. Until then, both parties held only a slip of paper recording the deal, but that slip could be sold again and again to anyone willing to pay a little more. The Dutch had invented the modern futures market, centuries before Wall Street, and they did so not through theory, but through instinct, driven by a mix of logic and collective enthusiasm. They believed that the value of tulips would continue to rise because, until that moment, it always had. In principle, the trade was practical. Tulips bloomed only for a few weeks each spring, and the rest of the year the bulbs remained underground. Trading in futures allowed commerce to continue, but as prices climbed, speculation replaced practicality. By 1635, single bulbs were selling for hundreds of guilders. By 1636, the most desirable varieties cost thousands. A craftsman in Haarlem might earn 200 to 300 guilders a year. Yet some tulip contracts traded for 5,000 guilders or more. Records show that one man sold a single bulb in exchange for a cartload of wheat, for oxen, 12 sheep, 2 barrels of wine, a bed, a suit of clothes, and a silver cup. Whether every detail of these stories was literal or exaggerated, the scale of the mania is undeniable. Prices detached from reality entirely. As the frenzy grew, tulip trading spread to nearly every town in Holland. Taverns became informal exchanges where buyers and sellers crowded around tables, drinking ale and scribbling agreements. These gatherings, half market and half spectacle, became the heartbeat of the new economy. Witnesses wrote that contracts could change hands 10 or 20 times in a single night, each time for a higher price. Speculators called themselves floristen, a term that once described flower lovers, but now meant something closer to gambler. Many never intended to take delivery of the bulbs they bought. They simply hoped to sell their contracts before payment came due. The market had turned into a game of confidence, a chain of promises with no end in sight. At the top of the pyramid stood the rarest bulbs: Semper, Augustus, Viceroy, and Admiral leaf guns. Their prices became legendary. One contemporary report claimed that a single Semper Augustus bulb sold for 10,000 guilders, the equivalent of a skilled craftsman's lifetime earnings. Whether that number was literal or symbolic, the point was clear. Tulips had become more valuable than gold. Painters captured this atmosphere with irony. In allegorical engravings, tulip traders were depicted as monkeys, dressed in fine clothes, arguing over bulbs, and eventually led to ruin. Even as the mania raged, the Dutch were aware of its absurdity. Yet awareness was not enough to stop it. The psychology of the market was intoxicating. People who had never speculated before found themselves drawn in. Servants pooled wages. Artisans mortgaged their workshops. Sailors invested their savings from years at sea. The logic was simple. Prices had never fallen. So why would they start now? Pamphlets from the era described the atmosphere vividly. One anonymous writer recalled a weaver who sold his loom to buy tulips, convinced that a single bulb would bring more fortune than 20 years of labor. A school teacher from Alkmaar wrote of his neighbors who talked of nothing but flowers, as if the world were made of petals. And for a while, the illusion held. Early sellers became rich. Newcomers envied them. Envy became momentum. Tulips were no longer judged for their color or beauty. Few buyers even saw the bulbs they purchased. What mattered was price, movement, and rumor. By late 1636, entire families were caught in the trade. In Haarlem, notaries recorded hundreds of tulip contracts per week. The city council itself invested in bulbs, while universities debated whether such speculation was sinful or simply the mark of progress. Yet the system contained its own flaw. Futures contracts in tulips were not legally binding. They were private agreements based on trust. Dutch law viewed them as gambling debts rather than enforceable contracts. As long as prices rose, no one cared. But if prices ever fell, buyers could simply walk away. The entire market, therefore, depended on a single shared belief that tulip prices would rise forever. By early winter 1636, that belief had reached its peak. The market was buoyant, irrational, and euphoric. Money moved faster than goods. Paper replaced petals. In taverns, traders toasted their luck. In drawing rooms, merchants congratulated themselves on being modern financiers. No one yet realized that their prosperity, like the flower they adored, was built on delicate layers, vivid, fragile, and destined to fade the moment the season changed. When the frost of 1637 arrived, it would bring not just the end of the bloom, but the end of belief. By the winter of 1636 to 1637, tulip speculation had grown into something close to collective delirium. Every class of Dutch society, from wealthy merchants to modest artisans, seemed caught in the fever. The market no longer revolved around flowers, but around contracts, notes, and whispers. Prices were discussed in taverns, written on chalkboards, and argued over in households. The flower that once symbolized elegance had become the fuel for a nationwide obsession. The trading centers of Haarlem, Amsterdam, Alkmaar, and Leiden pulsed with the rhythm of speculation. In the smoky air of taverns, deals were struck faster than drinks could be poured. Tables filled with coins, documents, and ledgers became makeshift exchanges. No tulip bulbs were in sight. The real business happened in ink and imagination. People passed around contracts for bulbs that might never be seen or touched. Agreements backed not by goods, but by confidence. The market had even developed its own rituals. Buyers and sellers sealed their transactions by clinking glasses of wine or brandy, a symbolic gesture known as the wine money fee. This small payment finalized a deal, much like a handshake on the stock exchange. The atmosphere was raucous and festive, filled with laughter and bravado. Everyone seemed certain that their fortune was just one trade away. Contemporary observers describe a society drunk on speculation. Carpenters, sailors, and bakers joined the frenzy, mortgaging property or selling tools to buy tulip futures. Notaries who once recorded property deeds now spent their days certifying tulip contracts. Women began investing too. Widows, innkeepers, even servants, pooling small sums to buy a share in a bulb that none of them would ever see. At first, the profits seemed unstoppable. Prices doubled, then tripled, then multiplied tenfold. One challah weaver, according to a pamphlet of the time, made 60,000 guilders in a single month, an impossible sum, roughly equivalent to several lifetimes of work. News of such successes only fueled the mania further. The Dutch, once known for sobriety and caution, had become gamblers on a national scale. The most sought-after bulbs, like Semper Augustus and Viceroy, rose to near mythical status. They were discussed like royalty, each bulb a story, a legend, a fortune waiting to unfold. Dealers gave public lectures describing their lineage, much as jewelers would praise the cut of a diamond. A single Viceroy bulb could sell for 4,200 gil, while a Semper Augustus might fetch 10,000, enough to buy a grand house in Amsterdam's most prestigious district. Artists and writers began mocking the craze even as it unfolded. One anonymous pamphlet titled Flora's Majawagen, Flora's Fool's Wagon, portrayed flower traders as madmen chasing wind. In the accompanying illustration, monkeys, dressed as merchants, exchanged tulip bulbs, fought duels over prices, and were eventually carted away in disgrace. The satire captured what everyone secretly knew. The entire system was absurd, yet no one could stop. The strange thing about a financial bubble is that it does not look like madness from the inside. To those living through it, it feels rational. Every trade seems justified by the last. Every increase supported by faith in progress. In the Dutch Republic, a society that had mastered the seas and perfected trade, confidence was as natural as breathing, and confidence is what the tulip market fed on. As long as people believed that someone else would buy at a higher price, the system held. But confidence is fragile. It cannot be stored like gold or guarded like treasure. It depends on mood, rumor, and trust. By January 1637, speculation had reached its height. Contracts for tulip bulbs were trading dozens of times a day, and even small provincial towns were hosting their own tulip exchanges. Some investors made fortunes without ever touching a bulb. The country had created wealth from air, or rather, from wind, as the Dutch called it. But the signs of strain were already visible. Prices had risen so high that few new buyers could afford to enter the market. Some wealthy merchants began quietly selling their holdings. Others hesitated to pay for contracts as settlement dates approached. Still, the majority carried on confident that spring would bring new buyers, new prices, and endless profit. The taverns of Haarlem buzzed late into the night. Tulip brokers shouted figures across rooms filled with smoke, wine, and ambition. A single bulb might change hands 10 or 20 times before morning. The idea that all this could collapse in a week seemed impossible. But every mania has its moment, a single tremor that reveals the cracks beneath. In the coming weeks, that tremor would arrive, not with thunder, but with silence. A single failed auction in a Haarlem tavern would mark the beginning of the end. The flower of fortune was about to wilt, and with it, the illusion that beauty could ever truly be sold. The winter of 1636 to 1637 marked the absolute peak of the Dutch Tulip Mania, moment when reason dissolved completely into the golden haze of speculation. For a few dazzling months, the entire country seemed to exist inside a dream of infinite wealth. Prices no longer followed any pattern, and buyers no longer cared about the quality or even the existence of the bulbs they purchased. The tulip had transcended its identity as a flower. It had become pure currency, a vessel for human desire. In the city of Haarlem, where much of the trade took place, contracts were changing hands faster than goods could be recorded. Bulbs were sold by the root, often while still buried underground. A dealer could buy a tulip bulb in the morning, sell the contract before lunch, and buy it back again by evening at a higher price, all without seeing a single petal. These were paper profits, built on paper promises, exchanged in a system that depended entirely on confidence and momentum. At the top of the pyramid stood the Semper Augustus, the flower that had become a legend. Its white petals, streaked with deep crimson, were said to shimmer like silk in sunlight. Only a handful of bulbs were known to exist. A single one reportedly sold for 12,000 gil, the equivalent of several houses on Amsterdam's Herengrecht Canal. The Viceroy, slightly less rare, fetched between 3,000 and 4,200 guilders per bulb. still enough to make or ruin a merchant's fortune. Contemporary records show that prices doubled or tripled within weeks. In Alkmaar, bulbs were traded like commodities on a daily exchange. In Leiden, universities debated whether tulip trading represented a sign of national genius or national madness. In Amsterdam, new types of contracts appeared. Options, wagers, and bundled sales that allowed buyers to speculate on entire collections of bulbs at once. The tulip trade had evolved into a sophisticated, if completely detached, financial system. Meanwhile, ordinary life continued around it. Painters still filled canvases with still lifes of blooming flowers, and merchants continued to finance ships bound for the Indies. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. The Dutch Republic, a nation built on discipline and hard labor, had discovered the intoxicating pleasure of unearned profit. The taverns of Haarlem and Alkmaar became theaters of fortune, filled with laughter, shouting, and the smell of spilled ale. There are stories, some exaggerated, some not, of sailors accidentally eating bulbs worth thousands of guilders, mistaking them for onions. One famous account tells of a cook who, unaware of the value of a bulb left on the counter, sliced it into a stew. When his master discovered the loss, he reportedly fainted. The bulb in question was said to be worth more than 2,500 guilders, a sum equal to a wealthy merchant's yearly income. The social divide between tulip speculators and the rest of the population widened rapidly. Preachers warned from pulpits that the tulip mania was a moral plague, a sign of greed, vanity, and divine punishment to come. Yet the warnings went largely unheard. To those caught in the trade, it felt like history's reward for a nation that had earned its wealth through toil and trade. Now, at last, the universe seemed to pay them back in abundance. Even respectable citizens joined the frenzy. Members of the guilds, weavers, carpenters, brewers, pooled their savings to buy shares in tulip contracts. Apprentices boasted that they would soon retire rich. Tavern owners accepted bulbs as payment for debts. There were even stories of marriages arranged through tulip contracts, with bulbs offered as dowries or gifts of prestige. The mania reached such intensity that tulip contracts began to serve as currency. In Sommeton's debts were settled with bulbs instead of coins. Wagers, property transfers, and even inheritances were denominated in tulips. People spoke of the Semper Augustus and Admiral Leifkins, the way modern investors speak of blue-chip stocks, as if they were permanent, guaranteed sources of value. Yet beneath the laughter and clinking glasses, a faint unease was spreading. The prices were so high that almost no one could afford to buy new bulbs. Fewer and fewer real exchanges were happening, and more trades existed only on paper. Seasoned merchants, the same men who had built fortunes trading pepper and silks, began quietly selling off their holdings. But the majority ignored these signals. They were too invested, too hopeful, too proud. It was in this fragile, euphoric atmosphere that a single event, seemingly minor, would trigger one of the fastest collapses in economic history. In early February 1637, a routine tulip auction was held in a Haarlem tavern. Buyers gathered, contracts ready, ale flowing, confident as ever. But for reasons still debated, perhaps a late frost, perhaps simple exhaustion, no one bid. The room fell silent. The auctioneer called again. Still, no offers. The first crack had appeared. Within days, panic began to spread. Prices faltered. Buyers vanished. Contracts were broken. The tulip that had once symbolized paradise had become a trap, and the air that supported the entire market was about to vanish. The Dutch would soon learn that even in the richest nation on earth, faith in endless growth could collapse overnight. The silence that began in that Haarlem tavern in February 1637 spread through the Netherlands like a chill wind. Within days, the once booming tulip trade collapsed completely. Buyers disappeared. Contracts were abandoned, and sellers were left holding worthless promises. The same merchants who had once toasted their fortunes now avoided eye contact in the streets. The Great Tulip Bubble, the first recorded speculative collapse in financial history, had burst. At first, disbelief reigned. In towns like Haarlem, Amsterdam, and Alkmaar, traders waited for the market to correct itself. Surely, they thought, the prices would rebound once buyers returned. But no one came. The same crowds that had filled taverns night after night suddenly vanished. The once lively exchanges fell silent. Tables that had once been piled with contracts and coins now stood empty, save for half-drunk mugs of ale and the sound of wind outside. Tulip prices plummeted almost overnight. Bulbs that had sold for thousands of guilders just weeks earlier could now barely fetch 10. The Semper Augustus, once the crown jewel of the tulip world, found no bidders at all. Even common varieties, the merchantess tulips that had traded for hundreds, now sold for less than a loaf of bread. The collapse revealed a truth that no one had wanted to admit. The vast majority of tulip contracts were based not on real goods, but on paper wealth. Few traders ever intended to take delivery of actual bulbs. They had simply bought and resold contracts in hopes of quick profit. When the music stopped, there were no buyers left, only layers of unpaid promises. The human toll was immediate. Craftsmen who had sold their workshops to join the frenzy were ruined. Farmers who had traded livestock for bulbs found themselves destitute. Tavern owners who had accepted tulips as payment discovered that their currency was now worthless. Lawsuits flooded local courts as creditors tried to recover money from vanished partners. But under Dutch law, tulip futures were considered gambling debts, and there was no legal way to force payment. This left thousands of people trapped in limbo. Merchants who owed vast sums could not pay. Creditors who expected fortunes received nothing. Entire neighborhoods of Haarlem and Leiden were plunged into quiet despair. Some families sold their furniture to cover debts. Others simply disappeared from town, leaving behind piles of worthless papers. Yet what makes Tulip Mania remarkable is not just its collapse, but its limited scope. Despite the chaos, the Dutch economy as a whole did not fall. The same ships still sailed, the same merchants still traded spices and silver, and the same painters still filled their canvases with calm domestic scenes. Tulip Mania had been a bubble within a bubble, a fever that consumed only a portion of society, yet symbolized something deeper about human nature. Pamphlets began circulating almost immediately, turning the collapse into moral theater. One widely read publication titled The Rise and Fall of Flora's Kingdom described the episode as a divine punishment for greed. Another, The Garden of Fools, mocked the speculators who sowed gold and reaped wind. In paintings and engravings, artists portrayed tulip traders as apes counting coins or crying over wilted flowers. But behind the satire lay real suffering. The people who lost the most were not the wealthy merchants who had entered early and exited quietly, but the middle-class artisans who had joined late. The weavers, brewers, and cobblers who saw in tulips a path to prosperity. Their losses were not abstract. A weaver might have sold his loom to invest in bulbs. A carpenter might have mortgaged his home. When the market vanished, so did their livelihoods. City councils tried to restore order. In Haarlem, officials proposed converting all tulip contracts into cash settlements at a fraction of their original value. Sellers would receive compensation, buyers would pay a token sum, and the market would be cleared. But even this compromise proved difficult to enforce. Trust, the invisible foundation of the Dutch financial system, had been shaken. The psychological consequences ran deeper still. For a nation that had prided itself on rationality and thrift, the tulip crash felt like a collective humiliation. The same people who built the world's first modern economy had been undone by a flower. Historians later argued over how much real damage the bubble caused. Some suggested it was limited, affecting only a small circle of speculators. Others saw it as a national wound, a moral reckoning disguised as an economic event. Either way, the memory of 1637 lingered for centuries. It became a parable retold in every era of financial excess. Proof that even the most practical, intelligent society could lose itself in illusion. And yet, amid the wreckage, tulips continued to bloom. The next spring, fields around Haarlem and Leiden were as bright as ever, their colors defying the despair that had surrounded them. Gardeners still tended their plots. Collectors still admired the symmetry of a perfect bloom. But something fundamental had changed. The flower had lost its magic. The Dutch no longer saw tulips as vessels of fortune or symbols of prestige. They had become reminders of folly, of fragility, and of the dangerous beauty of dreams, measured in money. From that point on, tulips returned to what they had always been. Plants that bloomed briefly, faded quickly, and reminded all who looked at them that even the most exquisite things are temporary. The panic that consumed the Netherlands in February 1637 was not loud or violent. It was quiet, confused, and eerily polite. There were no mobs, no riots, no armies of ruined men storming city halls. Instead, the Dutch, a people of discipline and record-keeping, faced their first true financial catastrophe with stunned silence. It began with whispers. In Haarlem, traders who had been meeting nightly in taverns suddenly stopped showing up. Auctions were postponed. 10 cancel. Buyers who had promised fortunes for bulbs began avoiding the sellers they once toasted with wine. When messengers arrived, demanding payment for contracts, doors stayed closed. For a few days, many pretended nothing had changed, as though ignoring the collapse might make it untrue. Then came the realization. The vast paper empire that had inflated around tulips had no foundation. The market had been built entirely on trust, and trust had vanished. No one knew what a tulip was truly worth anymore. 10 guilders, 100, or nothing at all. The same bulbs that had sold for thousands only weeks earlier could not find a single bidder. The Amsterdam Exchange, the most advanced financial institution of its time, had survived wars, plagues, and piracy, but it was powerless against panic. Tulip contracts were traded outside its official system, so no regulation or central authority could intervene. Each city had to manage the fallout on its own. In Haarlem, the epicenter of the trade, chaos unfolded behind closed doors. Merchants gathered in small groups to discuss possible solutions. Some proposed partial payments, others suggested annulling all contracts entirely. One desperate broker reportedly offered to deliver bulbs for free if his buyers would simply pay the wine money he had spent during the deals. Few accepted. In Amsterdam, wealthy investors who had sold early quietly celebrated their foresight, while others fell into despair. Stories circulated of families ruined overnight. A baker who had traded his bakery for tulip contracts was said to have returned to work as a laborer. A ship's captain, unable to repay his debts, fled to sea and never returned. Whether every story was true or embellished hardly mattered. The sense of collapse was real. In the Dutch Republic, reputation was everything. A man's creditworthiness was his social capital, and losing it meant exile from the respectable world of commerce. When the tulip bubble burst, thousands of small traders faced that invisible ruin, not starvation, but shame. Pamphleteers captured the national mood with cruel precision. One anonymous satire titled "The Foolish Merchant of Haarlem" described a man who bought the wind and sold his reason. Another, "The Tulip Merchant's Funeral," depicted mourners carrying a coffin filled not with a corpse, but with bulbs and papers. The church seized the moment as moral proof. Preachers thundered from pulpits that Tulip Mania had been divine punishment for pride and greed. Theologians compared the flower to the forbidden fruit of Eden, beautiful, tempting, and ruinous. "The Lord," one sermon declared, "has shown that those who plant vanity shall harvest dust." Yet not everyone accepted this moralizing tone. Some merchants argued that tulip trading had been a natural extension of commerce, an experiment in credit and futures trading that had simply gone too far. Others blamed speculators, foreigners, or even the weather. The winter of 1636 to 1637 had been harsh, with frost delaying the digging and transport of bulbs. Perhaps, they reasoned, the cold itself had frozen the market. But underneath the excuses, everyone understood the truth. The value of the tulip had never been real. It had been a story, a shared dream that only existed because everyone believed in it. And once that belief shattered, nothing could bring it back. The Dutch government faced a delicate problem. On one hand, enforcing tulip contracts could destroy thousands of families. On the other, ignoring them threatened the sanctity of all commercial agreements. If the word of a merchant could no longer be trusted, the entire Dutch economy, built on trade and credit, might falter. After weeks of debate, the government proposed a compromise. Buyers could cancel their contracts by paying sellers a small fee, about 3.5% of the agreed price. It was an attempt to stabilize the market without ruining everyone involved. But the proposal arrived too late. Confidence was gone. Most contracts were simply abandoned, and the tulip trade evaporated overnight. By spring 1637, the Netherlands returned to its ordinary business. Ships continued sailing to the Indies. Markets reopened. Life went on. But the psychological wound lingered. A nation that had prided itself on rationality had been swept away by fantasy. For years afterward, tulpingek tulip madness became a byword for collective folly. The irony was painful. The flower itself, untouched by the chaos, still bloomed that spring. Fields near Haarlem glowed red, yellow, and purple under the morning light. But for those who had once treated bulbs as gold, the sight carried no joy. Only shame. In that silence, the Dutch learned a lesson that would echo through centuries of financial history. That paper wealth, no matter how carefully written, can vanish faster than ink can dry. The full collapse of the tulip market took shape not in Amsterdam, but in Haarlem, the modest yet prosperous town that had been the beating heart of the trade. It was here, amid warehouses, taverns, and merchant houses, that the dream finally broke. Haarlem had once been a symbol of Dutch precision, famous for its linen, its beer, its orderly streets. By the spring of 1637, it had become the setting for a quiet financial disaster. In late January of that year, as prices reached their unbelievable peak, Haarlem's traders prepared for another round of tulip auctions. Contracts were stacked, buyers were ready, and speculation buzzed like a fever. But when the first bulbs went up for sale, something changed. The room, usually loud with shouts and laughter, hesitated. No one raised a hand. No bids came. The auctioneer repeated the price, lowering it slightly. Still, silence. What began as a pause turned into paralysis. That single moment, recorded by several witnesses, marked the beginning of the end. Within a few days, Haarlem's tulip market froze entirely. Word spread to nearby towns with the speed of rumor. In Alkmaar, Leiden, and Hoorn, buyers also began refusing to pay or attend sales. In a society that functioned on trust, this sudden refusal to believe was like cutting the anchor rope of a ship in a storm. The causes were simple but fatal. Tulip prices had risen beyond the means of even the wealthiest citizens. New buyers could no longer afford to enter the market, and those who had profited early were quietly selling out. The final spark came when a few traders failed to honor their contracts, setting off a chain reaction of disbelief. Every unpaid deal weakened another. The bubble, built on nothing but faith, collapsed under its own weight. Haarlem's taverns, once alive with noise and drink, tourned somber. The same men who had toasted their fortunes now avoided each other's gaze. Tables that had served as informal exchanges sat empty, save for a few scattered papers and spilled ale. Some brokers tried to continue trading, insisting that prices would soon recover, but their words carried no conviction. Local authorities watched with growing concern. The sudden disappearance of money from circulation threatened to ripple outward. Tulip speculation had involved not only merchants, but also artisans, farmers, and widows who had risked their small savings. The collapse did not cripple the Dutch economy, but it did strike at its moral foundation. The idea that commerce was a rational pursuit governed by discipline. Within weeks, Haarlem's Chamber of Commerce called for mediation. Merchants and city leaders met to discuss how to resolve the tangle of unpaid contracts. No one could agree on a fair solution. Sellers demanded compensation for bulbs they could no longer sell. Buyers refused to pay for assets, now worth a fraction of their price. By March 1637, the city council appealed to the national government for help. The States General, already preoccupied with the ongoing 80 Years' War, reluctantly intervened. They proposed that all tulip contracts made before the collapse could be annulled. If buyers paid a small compensation, roughly 3.5% of the original price, it was an attempt to restore faith without bankrupting thousands. The ruling brought temporary calm, but it could not erase the losses. For many, that 3.5% was still too much to pay for nothing. For others, it was an insult, a fraction of the fortune they believed was rightfully theirs. In Haarlem's archives, records show hundreds of abandoned cases. A merchant named Jan Hendricks, who had traded in bulbs for 3 years, declared bankruptcy. A weaver who had sold his loom for tulip contracts petitioned the council for mercy, writing that he had been led astray by the madness of the times. Families once proud of their thrift now found themselves begging for leniency. Yet outside the courts, the rest of Haarlem carried on. The mills turned, ships sailed, beer flowed. The tulip trade had been a sideshow compared to the vast machinery of Dutch commerce, but in every tavern and household, people spoke of little else. The word tulip became both a joke and a warning shorthand for folly. Artists, ever quick to capture the mood, immortalized the collapse in their work. In Jan Bruegel, the Younger's paintings, monkeys dressed as merchants counted coins and mourned over wilting tulips. A perfect metaphor for human vanity. Pamphlets appeared almost daily, ridiculing the speculators who had traded gold for bulbs. One anonymous poet wrote, "They sowed the wind and reaped the whirlwind, counting flowers as fortune, till fortune was gone." Despite the mockery, few could deny the fascination. The tulip had shown the Dutch something uncomfortable, that their greatest strength, confidence, could also be their greatest weakness. By the summer of 1637, Haarlem's tulip market was gone. The stalls were dismantled, the auctions cancelled, the traders scattered. Many of the bulbs, once guarded like treasure, were quietly planted again in the ground, their owners hoping at least to recover some beauty from their ruin. And when those bulbs bloomed that spring, the fields around Haarlem were radiant, streaked with red, gold, and violet under the morning sun. It was as if the land itself mocked the folly of its people, reminding them that nature keeps its own pace, indifferent to the dreams and delusions of those who try to price it. The Dutch would never forget that spring, the season when the world and its most rational merchants discovered the limits of reason itself. When the tulip market collapsed in the early months of 1637, the shock rippled quietly through the Dutch Republic. It did not destroy the economy or cause national panic. The ports still teemed with ships, the mills still turned, and trade with the East Indies continued as before. But beneath this surface calm, a more subtle wound spread. A deep sense of embarrassment, moral reckoning, and disbelief that a nation famed for prudence could lose itself so completely to illusion. For weeks after the crash, Haarlem remained the focus of chaos. Dozens of petitions arrived at the city as a court, daily sellers demanding payment, buyers pleading for mercy. The tulip trade had no formal regulation, and the states of Holland, the governing body of the province, found themselves inundated with requests for intervention. No one knew how to untangle the web of unpaid contracts, defaults, and broken promises. In April 1637, the States General convened to discuss the crisis. Their conclusion was pragmatic. Enforcing tulip contracts as legally binding would ruin too many citizens, while voiding them entirely would undermine the Republic's commercial credibility. They chose the middle path, allowing buyers to cancel their agreements by paying a modest 3.5% fee. It was a diplomatic compromise, and one that revealed the Dutch instinct for balance, but it could not restore trust. In the months that followed, the tulip trade evaporated almost entirely. The once booming tavern exchanges closed their doors. Brokers turned to other ventures, and the word tulpenhandel became an insult, a synonym for reckless speculation. De floristen, the flowermen who had once swaggered through Haarlem's markets, were mocked in pamphlets and plays as fools who had bought the wind and lost their senses. The press and clergy seized on the scandal as a moral lesson. Pamphleteers flooded the streets with printed warnings about greed, vanity, and divine punishment. One popular satire, "The New Mirror of Folly," featured a cover image of a merchant standing knee-deep in tulips while demons danced around him. Another, "The Weepers of Haarlem," depicted traders crying over barrels filled with bulbs instead of gold. Preachers compared the mania to biblical plagues. They saw in it the sin of hubris, the belief that man could control value and nature as easily as he built dikes against the sea. The Calvinist clergy, in particular, turned tulip mania into a parable about the dangers of pride in an age of abundance. The sermons resonated with a public already uneasy about its wealth. Among the victims, some stories became legend. A weaver who had traded his loom for tulip contracts died penniless in Leiden. A brewer in Hoorn, who once boasted of owning 10 Semper Augustus bulbs, was forced to sell his tavern. A widow from Alkmaar, who had invested her inheritance in bulbs, wrote to the city council begging that her debts be forgiven, calling herself the flower of misfortune. Yet, in the great balance of things, the Netherlands recovered quickly. The tulip bubble, though dramatic, had touched only a small segment of society. mostly speculators who had risked their savings voluntarily. The Dutch economy, anchored in global trade, shipping, and finance, remained robust. By 1638, the ports of Amsterdam were again filled with vessels bound for Asia and the Americas, carrying real goods with real value. Still, the tulip crash left a scar in the national consciousness. The Dutch, who had prided themselves on rationality and restraint, now found themselves a cautionary example. Foreign observers, particularly in England and France, mocked them mercilessly. English pamphlets referred to tulip traders as the mad merchants of Holland, and French writers called them the alchemists of petals. The story of their folly spread across Europe, becoming one of the earliest global morality tales about finance. Ironically, tulips themselves survived untouched. Dutch growers continued to cultivate them, though now with more modest ambitions. The fields around Haarlem and Leiden still burst into color each spring, but the flowers were admired for beauty, not profit. The Semper Augustus, once the symbol of unattainable luxury, quietly disappeared. The virus that had created its famous flames also weakened it to extinction. The tulip market would never recover its former glory, but its legend endured. Within a decade, pamphlets, plays, and paintings had turned the mania into myth. The story of how the world's most sensible people succumbed to the most irrational of dreams. And yet, even amid the mockery, a new understanding began to form. The tulip bubble had revealed something profound about the age. That money itself was no longer a solid thing, but an idea, a belief, a promise, a story told by many and undone by silence. In later centuries, when new bubbles emerged, the South Sea bubble in England, the Mississippi scheme in France, the railway mania, and the dot-com boom, writers and economists would look back to 1637 and find in it the original pattern of human speculation. The Dutch Tulip Mania became more than an episode of madness. It became a mirror, showing, again and again, that behind every bubble lies the same fragile hope, that something as fleeting as beauty can be made permanent, that value can grow forever, and that the petals will never fall. By the time the fields bloomed again that summer, the Dutch Republic had already moved on. The ships sailed, the markets opened, the painters painted, and life continued wiser, perhaps, but not cured. For in every age, a new flower waits to bloom. In the months and years following the collapse of the tulip trade, the Netherlands became consumed not by economic ruin but by reflection. The Tulip Mania, or tulpenjekte, as the Dutch called it, transformed into a cultural obsession, not as a financial tragedy, but as a moral one. Artists, pamphleteers, and preachers rushed to explain what had happened, to assign blame, and to turn folly into philosophy. The collapse had become a mirror, and every Dutch citizen saw something different in its reflection. The moralists saw divine punishment. To them, the tulip bubble was not an accident of economics, but a sin of the soul, a warning sent by God to a nation drunk on its own success. The Dutch Republic of the 1630s had been the richest society in the world, a country where merchants built mansions that rivaled palaces and painters immortalized their golden interiors. Preachers now pointed to those shining rooms and asked, had prosperity made the people proud? In churches from Haarlem to Delft, sermons thundered with words like greed, vanity, and idolatry. The tulip, once praised as a gift of nature, was recast as a symbol of temptation, the forbidden fruit of a commercial Eden. As Adam reached for the apple, one minister warned, so Holland reached for the tulip, and both found dust in their hands. Another sermon compared the flower to the Tower of Babel, a monument to pride, blooming for a season, only to fall and scatter. Calvinist preachers used the mania as proof of what happened when man worshipped wealth instead of work. They argued that the Republic had been seduced by the illusion that fortune could be created from nothing. In Terbio, the tulip craze had been a moral illness, a brief but dangerous moment when the Dutch forgot the virtues of thrift, diligence, and humility that had once defined them. The mockers, however, saw the story differently. To them, the collapse was comedy, an absurd farce born of human foolishness. Wheaten months, satirical pamphlets flooded Amsterdam. Essay, printing presses. One titled Flora as Fool as Fair portrayed the goddess of flowers presiding over a court of idiots who traded gold for bulbs and built castles in the air. Another, The Mad Gardeners of Harlem, described speculators as monkeys dressed as merchants who quarreled over weeds and sold clouds to each other. The engravings that accompanied these texts became iconic. In one, a procession of apes, symbolizing the traders, march proudly carrying tulips, while others weep as they are sold at auction or led to debtor's prison. The artist's message was clear. Greed had reduced civilized men to beasts. Even serious painters joined the chorus. In Jan Bruegel, the Younger's allegories, flowers and coins lay side by side, symbols of transience and vanity. The tulip, once painted as an emblem of grace, now appeared alongside skulls and hourglasses, reminders of mortality. Still life compositions known as vanitas became a defining artistic genre of the era, blending beauty with moral warning. A perfect bloom placed beside a rotting fruit or extinguished candle whispered the same truth. Everything fades. Writers, too, found meaning in the mania. Poets cahiers et the trade of air. Playwrights staged comedies about foolish merchants and their ruined families. Philosophers debated whether the tulip craze proved that markets were driven not by reason but by emotion, by envy, greed, and fear. Interestingly, not everyone agreed that the participants had been fools. A few pamphleteers defended the speculators, arguing that tulip trading was a natural extension of capitalism itself. The Dutch, they wrote, had always been innovators in shipbuilding, in finance, in trade. Tulip speculation was merely another experiment, one that had failed, but it also revealed something profound about modern economics. That value was no longer tied to metal or land, but to belief. This was a radical idea at the time, that wealth could be psychological, collective, and fluid. Some scholars now see Tulip Mania as the first public encounter with that modern reality. That markets are not governed by mathematics alone, but by stories people tell each other about what things are worth. Still, the popular memory of Tulip Mania remained moral, not intellectual. It became the archetype of greed, invoked whenever fortunes rose too fast or crowds chased impossible dreams. Over the following decades, Dutch painters, playwrights, and pamphleteers returned to the theme again and again, transforming the episode into a permanent cautionary tale. Foreign observers amplified the legend. English pamphlets described the Dutch as wise in trade, yet mad in flowers. French philosophers mocked them as marchants, the bend merchants of the wind. Even centuries later, during the railway and stock market bubbles of the 19th century, writers would point back to 1637 as proof that human greed was eternal. The irony was that the tulip, the flower at the center of it all, survived this moral storm untouched. Dutch gardens still bloomed each spring, and tulips continued to symbolize beauty, refinement, and patience. In time, they even became a point of national pride again. But a quieter kind, one rooted in craftsmanship, not speculation. By the end of the 17th century, the laughter and sermons had faded. The mania itself had become memory, a story retold in books, whispered in markets, painted in still lifes. Yet every Dutch merchant, every artist, and every preacher carried its echo. The knowledge that wealth built on imagination can vanish like morning mist, and so the tulip remained fragile, brilliant, and fleeting. The perfect emblem for both the glory and the folly of the age. When the laughter and sermons faded, what remained were the quiet lives of those who had truly suffered, the real victims of the tulip collapse. Behind the satire, beyond the grand moral lessons, lay ordinary Dutch men and women whose dreams had been crushed under the weight of promises that never bloomed. The wealthy merchants and speculators had lost pride. The commoners had lost everything. In Haarlem, Leiden, and Alkmaar, court archives preserved the stories in careful ink, short petitions, desperate letters, requests for mercy. They reveal not a nation of gamblers, but of artisans and workers who had been caught in something they barely understood. A weaver named Dirk Jans wrote that he had sold his loom 2x2 tulip bulbs, believing he could double his earnings before spring. When the market collapsed, he had nothing left to feed his family. His plea to the city council was simple. I sought honest profit, in an honest trade. A baker in Hoorn, who had accepted tulips as payment for bread, was ruined when the bulbs became worthless. He went before a magistrate claiming he had traded for hunger, not for gold. A widow from Leiden, whose husband had been a gardener, sold her small home to invest in bulbs. After the collapse, she took shelter with relatives, leaving behind the house she had lived in for 40 years. These were not speculators chasing fantasies. They were citizens who trusted the stability of their society. For decades, the Dutch Republic had rewarded enterprise and ingenuity. Its merchants had conquered oceans. Its bankers had financed kings. To ordinary people, tulip trading must have seemed no different, a way to join the prosperity that filled their cities. But when the market fell, the very qualities that had built the Dutch Golden Age, trust, optimism, and a belief in progress, turned against them. The Republic's greatest strength had always been its credit system, where reputation served as collateral and a man's word was as good as his coin. The tulip bubble broke that chain of faith. Neighbors stopped trusting one another. Business partners grew cautious. For the first time in living memory, the Dutch learned that paper could lie. Yet amid the ruins, there were also survivors, people who adapted, rebuilt, and even found opportunity in the wreckage. Skilled horticulturalists who had avoided speculation continued breeding and selling tulips, though at much lower prices. The tulip industry shrank but stabilized, becoming a respectable trade once more. Haarlem's fields remained a center of bulb cultivation, and over time, tulip growing became one of the Republic's most reliable exports. Ironically, the same qualities that had caused the bubble, curiosity, innovation, and ambition, helped the Dutch recover from it. The collapse did not destroy their economy. It refined Italiano. The merchants who survived became more cautious, developing stricter accounting systems and clearer legal definitions for futures contracts. By mid-century, the Amsterdam Exchange had re-emerged stronger, with better oversight and a more sober approach to risk. But the scars lingered in private life. Many families never recovered their lost savings. Debtors spent years repaying obligations from the mania's peak. Marriages broke under the strain of ruined finances. Young tradesmen who had once dreamed of easy wealth returned reluctantly to their workshops, older in spirit if not in age. The psychological toll was visible in art. Dutch painters of the 1640s and 1650s turned inward, away from the grandeur of earlier decades and toward domestic stillness. The interiors of Vermeer, with their quiet light and measured order, can be read as the opposite of tulip madness. The triumph of calm reason over chaos. The nation that had once celebrated fortune now painted silence. And yet, tulip mania never entirely disappeared. It lived on in stories, in jokes, in quiet warnings passed from parent to child. Grandfathers told their grandchildren how their own fathers had sold houses for bulbs, how fortunes had turned to dust overnight. The tale became part of the Dutch conscience, a moral inheritance, as real as their wealth. Historians centuries later would debate whether the tulip mania had truly been as catastrophic as legend claimed. Some argued that its scale had been exaggerated, that only a few hundred traders were truly affected. Others insisted that its impact was psychological, not economic, a collective awakening to the limits of speculation. Both were right in their way. The bubble may not have bankrupted the Republic, but it humbled it. It forced the nation that had conquered the seas to confront its own frailty. The realization that even the most rational society could be seduced by illusion. And yet, the Dutch recovered not through punishment, but through perspective. They learned to separate work from wealth, value from price, and fortune from faith. When the fields around Haarlem bloomed again, no one tried to measure their worth in guilt. The flowers were once more just flowers, delicate, transient, and priceless, only to the eye. In that return to simplicity, perhaps, lay the truest victory. The Dutch had lost their paper fortunes, but regained their sense of proportion, a lesson that would outlast every future bubble born in the centuries to come. By the end of 1637, only months after the crash, the Dutch Republic had done what few nations could. It quietly absorbed the impact, restored its economy, and continued prospering. Ships from the Dutch East India Company still sailed to Asia, loaded with spices, textiles, and porcelain. The Amsterdam Exchange resumed normal trading, and merchants returned to dealing in tangible goods. To the outside world, the Republic appeared unshaken, an island of order amid Europe's turmoil. But beneath that surface calm, something had changed. The faith that had sustained Dutch commerce, the unspoken belief in the reliability of contracts, in the honesty of partners, and in the logic of markets, had been fractured. The tulip bubble had shown that trust could be as volatile as prices, and that even the most rational system was vulnerable to collective emotion. Merchants, chastened by the mania, adopted stricter practices. Futures contracts were rewritten with clearer terms. Speculation without collateral was frowned upon. Financial institutions began requiring written guarantees for large transactions, a practice that would evolve into the modern margin system. These changes did not arise from government decree, but from the quiet adjustments of men who had learned, painfully, that optimism was not a substitute for discipline. Still, the loss of confidence lingered. For decades afterward, Dutch traders would use the phrase "tool, panendel," tulip trading, to describe any reckless or dishonest deal. Bankers and brokers invoked it as shorthand for warning. Beware the wind trade. In the arts, too, the mania's shadow persisted. The exuberant extravagance of early 17th century painting, rich banquets, golden rooms, grand displays of wealth, gave way to a more introspective style. The still lifes that followed were quiet, deliberate, and symbolic. Painters filled their canvases with fading flowers, extinguished candles, and skulls. Meditations on the tulip, once an emblem of glory, became the centerpiece of vanitous art, a reminder that beauty and fortune fade alike. For philosophers and theologians, the tulip episode raised deeper questions about the nature of value. In the decades that followed, pamphlets and essays debated whether wealth existed in material goods or in human imagination. The prevailing conclusion was unsettling, that markets, for all their arithmetic, depended on belief, a collective story that people agreed to tell each other. As one writer put it in 1641, "Gold is metal, and yet it moves men's hearts." The tulip was but a root, yet it moved them faster. The tulip crash also changed how the Dutch viewed themselves. The Republic had always seen its prosperity as a moral victory, proof that diligence and faith could triumph over nature and war. The Tulip Mania shattered that certainty. It showed that even a disciplined society could lose its bearings. That moral virtue did not guarantee financial wisdom. The Dutch, who once saw themselves as chosen by Providence, now saw themselves as human, capable of folly like any other nation. Foreign commentators never let them forget it. English pamphleteers mocked the Hollanders, who traded petals for palaces. French writers turned the episode into philosophical satire. The Jesuits, long enemies of Dutch Calvinism, declared it divine retribution for Protestant pride, yet the mockery could not erase the Republic's achievements. Even at its most irrational, the Dutch economy had been robust enough to survive a financial storm that would have destroyed others. Indeed, within 2 years, Amsterdam's merchants were once again lending money to European kings. The city remained the financial capital of the continent. The tulip crash had humbled the Dutch spirit, but it had also hardened it, teaching them to balance ambition with caution, innovation with restraint. One of the most enduring lessons was psychological. The Tulip Mania revealed the power of collective emotion, how entire communities could move together in euphoria or fear. Merchants who once prided themselves on logic now understood that markets were not machines but living organisms, moved by confidence, rumor, and imitation. This realization would shape the Dutch approach to finance for centuries. They became more analytical, more empirical, more aware of the human element behind every price. Meanwhile, life for ordinary citizens returned to rhythm. The baker baked, the weaver wove, and the ships kept arriving from the East Indies, carrying pepper and silk instead of dreams. The tulip fields bloomed again each spring, as they always had, but fewer people stopped to count their worth. The flower had become a symbol not of fortune, but of fragility. In time, the story of Tulip Mania settled into folklore. Parents told it to their children as a warning against greed. Writers included it in collections of moral tales. Philosophers used it to explain human irrationality. And economists, though that word had not yet been coined, would later point to it as the first recorded asset bubble in history. Yet even as the Dutch tried to forget, the world would not. The Tulip Mania became a parable retold in every generation that followed. Whenever prices rose too high, whenever crowds believed too easily, whenever paper wealth grew faster than reason. And so, the flower that once brought ruin became immortal. The Dutch Republic recovered its prosperity, but the tulip, delicate, brief, and bright, remained forever entwined with the story of human ambition. It had shown that civilization's greatest danger was not poverty, but excess. Not ignorance, but overconfidence. And though the dikes still held, and the ships still sailed, something unseen had cracked in the Dutch mind. The serene faith that reason alone could govern the hearts of men. What emerged from the ashes of the tulip collapse was something far more profound than a change in trade law or accounting practice. It was the birth of financial psychology, the dawning realization that markets are not purely mechanical systems of value and exchange, but reflections of human emotion, imagination, and fear. Before 1637, the Dutch, and indeed most of Europe, believed that prices followed the logic of scarcity and utility. The Tulip Mania shattered that illusion. It revealed that value could be entirely disconnected from use, that people could assign infinite worth to something useless if they believed others would do the same. It was, in a sense, the moment when economics crossed paths with psychology. Writers of the late 17th century began grappling with this paradox. A pamphlet published in 1642 titled The Folly of Flowers observed that men trade not in roots or bulbs, but in dreams of gold. Another, The Merchant's Reflection, proposed that the human mind was a market unto itself, where fear and hope bargain endlessly. Such lines read like early echoes of behavioral economics, centuries before anyone gave it a name. The Dutch, practical as ever, responded not with theory but with quiet observation. Merchants began studying the patterns of panic and euphoria. They noticed how quickly crowds moved from greed to fear, how confidence could vanish overnight. This awareness spread across Europe, influencing how future financiers viewed speculation. The Tulip Mania became a reference point, the first case study in the irrational behavior of rational men. Even outside the world of commerce, philosophers found lessons in it. Thinkers like Spinoza, who lived in Amsterdam during the aftermath of the mania, argued that human passions, desire, envy, pride, were natural forces that could overpower reason. While he never mentioned tulips directly, his writings on emotion as a fundamental driver of human action resonated deeply in a society still haunted by the memory of financial madness. Artists, too, absorbed the psychological implications. The Vanitas painters, who filled their canvases with flowers, skulls, and fading candles, captured more than moral warning. They painted the anatomy of desire itself. Each tulip bloom became a metaphor for human ambition. Vivid, beautiful, doomed to wither. In this art, economics and mortality became intertwined. Speculation was not just about money, but about the illusion of permanence. The tulip episode also changed how people viewed risk. Before the mania, risk had been a technical matter. The chance of a ship sinking, a storm destroying crops, or a debtor failing to pay. Afterward, it became something internal, tied to emotion. The risk was no longer just in the object, but in the mind. In the temptation to believe that fortune could defy reason, Dutch merchants began speaking of emotional contagion. The way one man's confidence could infect another until the whole market moved as one. Over time, this understanding would shape the foundations of modern finance. The Amsterdam Exchange, rebuilt after the crash, introduced more structured trading practices. Credit contracts required written backing. Speculation was confined to regulated venues. The idea that markets could be self-regulating through rational behavior was replaced with the idea that markets required discipline precisely because humans were emotional. The Tulip Mania thus became, unintentionally, one of history's most important teachers. It introduced the concept that the economy was not simply about gold, goods, or trade routes. It was about belief. Every trade, every contract, every price depended on a shared faith and value. When that faith faltered, the entire structure could crumble. This insight spread far beyond the Netherlands. English financiers cited the Dutch collapse when debating their own speculative schemes, from colonial ventures to joint stock companies. French economists studied it when designing systems of credit. By the 18th century, the tulip madness had entered common vocabulary as shorthand for irrational speculation. But the most profound legacy was personal. The Dutch themselves, who had once considered their prosperity a divine reward, began to see it instead as a fragile human construction, something that required humility as well as skill. The tulip had taught them that markets mirrored the soul of a people, calm or chaotic, disciplined or delirious. In later centuries, historians and psychologists alike would look back to 1637 as the dawn of a new kind of awareness. The moment when humans first saw themselves reflected in their own economic behavior. Every future bubble, from the South Sea and Mississippi schemes of the 1700s to the stock market crashes of later centuries, would be traced to the same source, the eternal dance between greed and fear. And yet, there was beauty even in the folly. The Tulip Mania had begun as an act of admiration, a celebration of nature's perfection. Its collapse revealed not ugliness, but vulnerability, the way humans could turn wonder into obsession and obsession into ruin. In that paradox, the Dutch found something enduring. The tulip, fragile and fleeting, became both a warning and a comfort. A reminder that while human reason may falter, the capacity to hope, to dream, and to rebuild never truly dies. When the next spring came and the fields around Haarlem bloomed once more, the flowers no longer symbolized greed or grandeur. They symbolized resilience, proof that beauty could return even after madness. Centuries after the crash of 1637, the Tulip Mania still lives not in the fields of Haarlem, but in every story of a boom gone wrong. It has become the ghost that haunts the world's financial history, whispering the same warning each time humanity convinces itself that this time will be different. The flower that once dazzled Dutch merchants now blooms in digital charts, real estate graphs, and speculative dreams of every age. The pattern is always the same. The object changes: shares, railroads, gold, dot-coms, cryptocurrencies. But the rhythm repeats: discovery, excitement, growth, frenzy, collapse. The tulip's petals may have withered long ago, but its shape remains etched into the psychology of money. Each generation plants its own version of the bulb, hoping that beauty can somehow be made permanent, that wealth can grow forever. The Dutch Tulip Mania has been invoked again and again. During the South Sea bubble of 1720, when British investors believed an ocean of profit lay across the Atlantic. During the Mississippi scheme in France, where paper currency inflated dreams of empire. In the railway bubbles of the 19th century, when the world imagined steel tracks could stretch endlessly into fortune. And most recently, in the speculative storms of the 21st century, from housing markets to crypto. Each time, economists, journalists, and cynics reach for the same comparison. It's just like the tulips. And perhaps it always is. The Tulip Mania endures, not because of the flower, but because it revealed a universal truth, that markets are not driven by logic, but by stories. Every bubble begins as a beautiful narrative of innovation, of progress, of freedom from old limits. In the Dutch Republic, it was the dream that beauty itself could become wealth. In later centuries, it became the dream that technology, credit, or data could do the same. The flower merchants of Haarlem may have scribbled their trades with quills, but the same impulses now move billions of dollars across screens in milliseconds. The taverns have become trading platforms. The wine money, transaction fees. Instead of bulbs and soil, there are digital coins, NFTs, and futures. Intangible, volatile, traded in clouds of code. The old Dutch word, windhandel, the wind trade, has taken on a new and literal form. Business conducted in invisible air. And just as in 1637, the feeling of the crowd remains intoxicating. Prices rise, fortunes multiply, skepticism fades. Experts warn that the system is fragile, that values are detached from reality, and still no one listens. Not because they don't understand, but because they don't want to. Hope as it turns out, is the strongest currency ever minted. Historians often describe the Tulip Mania as the first recorded bubble, but it was also the first mirror. It showed how closely the human mind ties identity to possession, how desire can be dressed as sophistication, and greed disguised as innovation. The Dutch believed they were cultivating beauty, but they were really cultivating belief. And when belief collapsed, they mistook the loss of illusion for the loss of value itself. Modern economics would later give this ancient lesson new names: herd behavior, irrational exuberance, speculative feedback loops. But the heart of it remains the same. Emotion disguised as reason, multiplied across thousands of minds. The Tulip Mania did not just birth modern finance, it revealed its soul. For the Dutch of the 17th century, the experience became part of their national conscience. Their descendants grew into the architects of modern capitalism, building financial systems that would spread across the world. The lessons of 1637 shaped the rules of credit, insurance, and futures markets. Every contract signed today, every regulation guarding against fraud or panic, carries the DNA of those vanished bulbs. And yet, the flower that once brought ruin also brought beauty. The tulip fields of the Netherlands survived the mania, and today they stretch 4 miles, blanketing the land in colors that attract millions of visitors each spring. The very plant that once symbolized greed now stands for national pride. Proof that even from folly, something lasting can bloom. The Tulip Mania reminds us that progress and peril often grow from the same root. The same imagination that invents new ways to trade also invents new ways to dream. And while dreams may burst like bubbles, they always leave behind seeds, ideas that sprout again when the soil is ready. For centuries after Haarlem's traders went silent, the story of the tulip still matters, not as a joke about human foolishness, but as a reminder that value is belief, and belief is fragile. Every screen that flickers with prices, every chart that climbs, every investor chasing the next bloom, all are heirs to the same fragile hope that the Dutch once planted in their fields. And when the next great bubble comes, as it always does, it'll be easy to mock the dreamers, to laugh at their blindness. But somewhere, beneath the numbers and noise, there will always be the same human longing to hold beauty, to master uncertainty, to believe, for a moment, that the petals will never fall, because they always do. The frenzy is long faded now. The fields of Haarlem rest in quiet rows, their bulbs asleep beneath the soil. The canals are still, the night air soft. Where once crowds shouted and fortunes rose and fell, only the wind moves steady, unhurried, eternal. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear it. The distant hum of a ship leaving Amsterdam, the rustle of paper contracts in candlelight, the murmured laughter of traders who believed the world had discovered endless wealth. They are gone now, their names forgotten, but the lesson they left still lingers in the air like the faint scent of spring. The tulips will bloom again, as they always do, bright, brief, and breathtaking. Their colors will draw the same wonder they did for centuries ago, reminding us that even folly can leave behind beauty. And perhaps that is the mercy of history, that from every burst of madness, something enduring still grows. So breathe slowly. Let the noise of markets and numbers drift away. Imagine the wind over the Dutch fields, cool and constant, whispering through the flowers. Imagine the petals glowing in the early light, fragile, perfect, and free from price. The past has quieted now. Its lessons remain, but its pain is soft. What was once greed has become understanding. What was once ruin has become wisdom. And somewhere beneath the soil, new dreams are waiting to bloom. Tender, uncertain, and as fleeting as the dawn.